Welcome back to the workshop. Thanks for clicking on this video. This is part 2 of the gin card for my niece's wedding. Part 1 was making the gin marquee letters, and I'll put a link in the corner if you haven't seen that one. This video I've decided to dedicate to making the wheels. These are 9-spoke wheels made predominantly with the router. So I popped down to my local timber merchants and grabbed some 20mm 3/4 inch stock. The wheel's going to be made out of 8 pieces of these. Each one cut to length roughly about 48 centimetres. Once I've marked them up, I then pop over to the chop saw and cut them to length. After cutting each one to length, I then add in a small mitre 45 degrees on each end. To cut the centre hub, I use my circle cutting jig on my bandsaw. It's really just a piece of wood with some fences on the bottom. I then tack the hub in the centre, push it onto the bandsaw and spin it round. It then cuts me a really nice, almost perfect circle. I take it over to my disc sander and just spin it around a few times. This is going to save time later. Once the spokes are in place, it's going to be really tricky, so it's quicker and easier to do this now before actually assembling the whole wheel. So that's now nice and smooth and ready to use. I then tack the centre hub down into a piece of MDF. You can see here I've already made one wheel. The router lines show where everything's going to be. I add in a couple of screws. Everything's going to be painted when I finish, so I'm not too worried about the screw holes. I'm just going to fill those in later. Once I've got the centre hub screwed in place, I then start positioning the 4 pieces for making the rim of the wheel. These aren't critical in positioning, just as long as they cover the routed circle you can see before. The most important thing is they get the mitres lined up nicely with no gaps. I've got some lines pre-marked, so this allows me to position everything just how I want it. Once I'm happy with the first one, I can then drill and screw that piece down onto the jig. It doesn't matter about these screw holes because these are going to get cut off once I've cut the outside of the rim. I position my router into the original hole in the middle, give it a little tap, the centre pins, then clamp the work down so it's not going to be spinning round when I try and cut the circle. Once I've got it clamped in place, it's just a matter then of getting the router turned on and spinning that router around that centre point, letting the router do the work, not taking too much off at a time. Just keep spinning that router, taking it down every so often, and eventually I'll cut the rim. And then the final pass, literally as I'm working around, grabbing out the centrepiece, the scrap, popping that to the side, and I'm left with the internal cut for the rim, ready to do the next step. Obviously I've created a load of sawdust here in the workshop, so it's always a good habit to tidy up as you work. Okay, so this is the jig. It's basically a slot with a small wooden peg, and the angle between the peg and the slot is 40 degrees. Put a screw in place just to stop it moving around while I'm doing the first cut, and then add the collar into the base of my router. I still can't believe that I haven't lost these small screws, but these are the originals that came with it. Okay, so once the collar's in place, which will slide perfectly in the slot on the jig, plunge the router down to the depth and then cut into the hub first of all and then out to the rim. And this cuts me 2 nice slots which the spokes can slot into. I then remove the screw that was holding the jig in place, and once this screw's out I can then rotate the jig and you see how it slots into place nicely in the first cut hole. Now it's just a process of repeating this 8 times into the hub and then out to the rim again. Each time rotate the jig and slotting that little peg into the previous cut. Once it's done on the hole number 9, on the slot number, once it's done on slot number 9, that router bit's getting a bit blunt, so I think I'll replace that. Once it's done, rotate it round, and because it's 40 degrees and 9 fours make 360, you can see here that the slot lines up perfectly with the first one. I then put some registration marks on each piece just to make sure that I don't get them mixed up when I'm trying to glue them all together. Remove everything from the jig. Now on to the second half of the wheel. Because this is going to be glued in place and eventually I'll be taking the screws out that hold the hub in, I put some double-sided tape down. This means that once I take the screw out, the hub isn't going to slide around. So here's the hub going in, down onto the double-sided tape. The repeat of the process I've just performed. So screwing each of the 4 pieces into place. Once they're in place, grab my router and spin that router around and cut myself another circle. Back onto the jig again and cut the slots. It's very satisfying, this jig. It worked really nicely. I was very pleased with the way it went. Buy some broom handles, because this is probably the cheapest way of getting hold of the dowelling I need. If I was to buy dowelling, it'd be far more expensive. In the UK, these are about, I think these are about £2 each from a local DIY store. I cut in very roughly on the bandsaw, a square up each end. I'm not too concerned about being accurate here. Just want to literally take off the bulk of material quickly. I'm just making sure I don't make this ends too small. I don't want them to rattle around when they go into the hub and the rim. Once I've done one end, flip it around, do the other end, the same process. Just literally just making sure I get a nice little square cut. Over to my belt sander, and I use the right on the edge where the radius of the belt is. I then just take out the saw marks and square up that end as best as possible. Now up to glue up. Using plenty of glue on the rim and on the hub. Almost forgot to take those screws out. That could have been disastrous if those screws had been in place. I wouldn't have been able to disassemble this. So once those screws are taken out, add some more glue and just smooth it out with a brush, making sure I get into all of those rebates cut in the rim and into the hub. These spokes have been test fit before just to make sure they're going to go in without causing me any problems. On the first hub I didn't test fit enough and I did have a couple of issues, so this time I learnt by my mistake. Offsetting at 45 degrees, I then put the other half of the rim on. So now all of these joints are now 45 degree lap joints. Incredibly strong. There's no way these is going to move or come apart. Once I've got everything lined up and I'm happy with it, I'll grab some clamps. All my long clamps here get used just to keep everything pushed together as tight as possible. You can see here I use some orange tape to stop the pieces of wood getting glued onto the rim. Because I can't get any clamps to the centre, to the hub, I add in 4 screws. Now these screws are going to stay in place to the finished thing. Because it's going to be painted, I'll just fill these and then paint over the filler. Once it's dried, whip all the clamps off and then over to the bandsaw to cut round the outside of the rim. And the wheel diameter, I think I might have mentioned before, is about 15 inches, 38 centimetres. Once that's cut, I can then use my router with my flush cutting bit to just run around and cut the excess wood off. It's a bit of a slow process, there's quite a bit to do. The wheel needed an axle space, and I can't get this now onto my pillar drill, so I have to drill this by hand on the bench. I work through from each side and meet in the middle. Oh, I should have put that in properly. Oh well. I'm using this 2-part quick drying filler, which is great because it goes off very quickly and you can then carry on working without having to wait for stuff to dry up. Once that filler's mixed, then it's just a matter of working onto the wheel, filling the screw holes, and there were 1 or 2 patches on the inside of the rim and on the corners where I had a little bit of tear out. Once that dried, sand everything smooth, working around the whole wheel, making sure it's all good for paint. I'll give it 2 coats of undercoat, and this is just a quick drying water-based undercoat. And once the undercoat's dried, after that's gone off, I then put on a top coat of just a satin white. And there's the finished wheel. I'm really pleased with the way they turned out. They roll really nicely. So, don't forget to like and subscribe to watch the final part. Thanks for watching.